I'm here with my friend Hopkinson Smith. Hoppy, as I think a lot of people call him. We've known each other, not well, but for a really, really long time. We were in high school together about 1,000 years ago, and we shared some time with some teachers at Harvard, not shared time, but had some of the same teachers. And everybody here will know Hoppy Smith as one of the world's, maybe the world's foremost lute, guitar, plucked instruments player, and a faculty member for many decades now at the Schola Cantorum in Basel. It's a great pleasure to see you, Hoppy, and thanks for being willing to talk with us.
My pleasure, Tom.
Right. Well, listen, what we're interested here a little bit is how individual artists came to this idea of early music. I mean, I think you were a musician from the moment you were born, but how did it happen for you, A, that you did music, and B, that you got oriented towards what we now call early music or historical performance or whatever?
Well, the process is always gradual in my experience, and I was always drawn to plucked instruments. And as a teenager, I played every kind of guitar and mandolin and banjo, etc. I didn't really discover the classical guitar until I was 18 or 19. And then I really was taken by the guitar and did as much as I could to try and become a decent guitarist. At the same time, I discovered the lute. And the lute, the shape of the lute, the sound of the lute, the a little bit archaic aspect of the lute and its enormous repertoire, all these things influenced me, and I was able to borrow the so-called work lute from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It wasn't a historical instrument, it was a modern, solid instrument shaped like a lute with double strings. And this was my beginning. And then I ordered a lute a year later from Donald Warnock, who was the only real lute maker at that point in the New England area, as far as I know. And I got started, and I had more and more to do with the lute. This is a Renaissance lute at first, in terms of local ensemble work, perhaps a solo concert here and there. And then I decided to come to Europe to start to study the Baroque lute with Eugen Dombois, who was the teacher at the Schola Cantorum at that point. And I remember asking Franz Brüchen and Harnoncourt, when both of them came through Cambridge, who they would suggest as a lute teacher, and sort of trying to share my passion and curiosity with them. And I came then for, I thought, 1 year. And this is something like 45 years ago.
Right.
Yeah. And then one thing led to another. I started to play the Baroque lute. I began playing the Baroque guitar, this and that. I was one of the few people playing continuo on the plucked instruments at that time. And there were all kinds of opportunities that opened up. And it was something like living the dream for an American. And first of all, in coming to the school, I felt as though I was coming into the Renaissance from the Middle Ages, just for the opportunities, for the culture that was there, for the openness, for the color of sound and life. And then, of course, the possibility to play in Paris and Madrid and Stockholm and so forth. I began to teach a couple of years after that. I didn't last actually that long in the Schola as a student. But anyhow, these were the beginnings. And then, you know, you're always looking for something. And I'm still looking, I'm still sort of focusing on going forwards and trying to figure this out or trying to figure that out. And there was there were moments at the beginning where you'd just have one discovery after another that just came through your own experience. And some of this experience then, of course, I'm now sharing with students or have over the years, because a good student will figure these things out himself, but a teacher can save them a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, interesting. You talk about learning as much as you could about the lute. When you began the lute with the work lute from the MFA in Boston, were there lute teachers, or did you have to figure this out yourself?
I mean, I did study guitar for a couple of years with Bob Sullivan, and he had a lute, and we actually played together, but it wasn't really a student-teacher kind of relationship on the lute. It was rather just looking for shared experience and so forth. But basically, I was self-taught, and then I began to teach at Wellesley College of all places. I think you also taught at Wellesley.
I did, yes.
And I was already teaching the lute there, and I'd never had really a lute lesson in my life. Lute and guitar I was teaching. And I began to teach at Langy School, just up the road from the Harvard Music Department. And actually, when I came to Europe for that 1 year in 1973, I hung on to the teaching positions that I had in the Boston area with the thought that I would come back and pick up where I'd left off.
Yeah. So you were sort of self-taught. You sort of had to figure it out. I guess, I mean, looking at the various kinds of tablature was the simplest part of it. And then just figuring out how to get your hands, left hand and right hand, around where you want them to be. To what extent is it closely related to the guitar?
You know, the left hand work is often similar to the guitar, and the right hand, of course, at first as a guitarist, you start to play the lute a little bit like the guitar until the instrument, the lightness of the instrument, the thinner strings and so forth, the much more delicate touch that's necessary, until that sort of leads you in a new direction. But just as the early lutes, I mean, early 20th century lutes were kind of influenced by the guitar, so were many of the players influenced by the way they played the guitar before. And this is
Julian Bream, for example, was a guitarist, really, wasn't he?
He was a fabulous communicator, let's put it that way. Whatever instrument he was playing, and he was a real inspiration for a lot of people, myself included. And it didn't matter that he played it whatever way he wanted. There was just so much dynamism there, and so much control and self-securedness that one was blown away.
Huh. You know, you've over the course of time, maybe it's just accidental that you began with Renaissance and moved to later stuff and began to do some of the great Baroque French repertoire and other things. And in fairly recent times, I think you've not only played the so-called Bach lute suites, but actually recorded the Bach violin partitas and sonatas in an arrangement, in your arrangement for the lute. The notion of arrangements is a really interesting one. I mean, given that maybe I'm wrong on this, but it seems to me that about half of the surviving Renaissance lute music is arrangements of other kinds of music, intabulations and things like that, mostly of vocal music, but not exclusively. And it's also true that people are beginning to feel a little less constrained about playing Bach on the wrong instrument, because Bach himself did it all the time. Moved music to where he needed it. If he needed a harpsichord concerto, he knew where to get one. He had one in the bottom drawer. It just happened to be written for some other instrument. But say something, if you would, about your own relationship to Bach and transcribing music. There being so much music for the lute that you haven't recorded. Why are you recording music that's not for the lute?
Good questions. First, I just want to say this little image of Bach as the ecological composer who recycled as much of his own work as he wanted to. Well, you know, you listen to the violin playing the sonatas and partitas, and I remember as a teenager hearing recording, vinyl recording in the music room of the school we both went to, of someone playing, must have been the first sonata. And I thought to myself, something's not quite right here. But of course, I wasn't able to articulate it. And years later, I began to articulate it. Well, anyhow, what I always say is that there are two things. One is the natural attraction to some types of music, with that when you hear it, you want to be part of it. You want it to be part of you. You want to play it. You want to live it out and make it your own. And the other thing is, on any instrument, for any style, you want to have a physical gesture that perfectly reflects the musical gesture. That is, if this music is awkward and angular, this and this way and that, then you're going to move in the same. If it's lyrical and touching, you're going to move in a different way. And what the violinist is forced to do is in the polyphonic passages to use the bow in such a way that they quickly get and suggest the other voices without losing the main voice, which is usually the top of the texture, musical texture. And so I always say, often with the violin, there's something of a raging sea battering against the cliffs of the coastline, and the lute moves inland. It's a much more pastoral landscape. And of course, you don't play it in the same high octave as the violin. Almost everything is an octave lower. And you have the possibility to sustain and clarify the basses. And I mean, there's countless things one could say more specifically about what you do here and what you do there. But there's so much that almost invites the lute to participate that I couldn't resist. And there's one more thing that I want to say is that it's documented that Bach himself, I think it was sort of like at the end of the day or something like that, he would sometimes sit at the clavichord and play the sonatas and partitas for violin, adding the voices that are impossible on the violin. That is elaborating on the polyphonic mesh that's behind and below and around and above these works. And I mean, we do the things mainly because we want to do them ourselves, but it's always interesting to have a historical confirmation that this fits right in with the pragmatic way of thinking of the 18th or the 17th or the 16th or the 15th centuries.
Well, it's very beautiful, your versions of these things, and it really is revelatory in lots of ways. And I'm very glad you went to the trouble to do that. It requires a deep knowledge of the music and a deep knowledge of your own instrument, I guess.
It wasn't the only trouble.
No, I'm sure not. So, Hopia, you've had and still have a very distinguished solo career. You've also performed with others, haven't you? I think you've spent some time with Jordi Savall and were involved in the creation of the Hespèrion 20, as it was then, back in the day.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, so can you say something about that? That seems so interesting.
This was the first sort of intense ensemble activity that I was involved in here in Basel. At that time, Jordi Savall, Montserrat Figueras lived in Basel. They were both at different times connected with the Schola. Jordy wasn't teaching quite at the same time that I was there as a student, but Montserrat was studying voice and was interested in all kinds of the new winds of change, for instance, in vocal technique. Anyhow, we had an incredible intensity of activity and musical exchange of ideas and fighting and loving and all these things that musicians do in close quarters. Yeah, and it was a very creative time. And I didn't last more than about 10 years we worked together. And then actually Hespèrion began to get bigger and bigger at the same time that I was thinking I was going to get smaller and smaller. And what I mean is I was more and more interested in following just the not the career, but the intensity of work that is entailed in getting a lot of the solo music together. And I realized that if I really wanted to do this as well as I could, I would need to spend a lot more time. And then there was sort of a shift over, this is in the mid 80s or beginning of the 80s already, a shift to doing more solo work. And in between, I did recordings here and there, some with Jordy again, a couple with Montserrat, and a few other with Ton Koopman, a number of projects and so forth.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things that a lot of people we've talked to have to say is something to do with the recording industry and what a huge difference, what an important role that played in the careers of a lot of people in the 70s and 80s, something that has changed enormously since then. But could you say something about how recording affected your own kind of career or activities?
It's certainly been very important for me. Also for the organization of my thoughts and projects and so forth. It, always knowing you have a new recording to work towards, and that actually then people write you from all corners of the world that they've heard this or that or what it means to them. And it's always sort of a surprise to know that somehow you touched people's hearts in various countries and who play various music or don't play instruments themselves. Anyhow, it is still a fabulous opportunity. Yes, I'm very thankful for these opportunities. And of course, nowadays, the market is flooded with lute records.
Yeah, but they're all trying to be like you, and they're not many of them are getting there. You have the good fortune to have sort of set the bar yourself, and they have the bad fortune that you set it very, very high.
Oh.
There are a lot of there's a lot in the history of recording that sort of changes. I mean, I think tastes change, recording techniques change. People have gotten better on their instruments in many cases in the historical performance world, so that some of the pioneering recordings that we remember from the early 1970s, say, which were enormously important for all of us, are now things that you would not probably put out. But I don't know. I mean, I don't want to ask you about your own recording career, but I don't feel the same way about your work. I somehow feel like you are probably willing to stand behind everything that you've recorded. Is that so?
You know, I don't, how shall I put it? I don't embarrass myself by putting on my old recordings to see how they sound.
Right. You're looking forward, not backwards.
Exactly.
Which makes you not really an early music guy at all. But the relationship there used to be between recording and public performance. When I think of artists, solo artists or ensembles also, there used to be a sort of model that you give enough public performances to get well enough known to get a recording contract, which was the thing that people mostly wanted because it brought in a lot of money. And then after that, you also did further concert tours and that kind of thing. But that was sort of as much in the service of the recording as the recording was in the service of getting concert dates. I don't know how those two things are related for you.
Well, if I think back to my first recordings, I'm just trying to think. I think one of the first recordings I made in Europe was the first Marais recording with Jordi Savall and Anne Gallet for Astray. And it was just the beginning of Astray recordings. And Michel Bernstein, who was the creator of Astray, he had a vision, and he was very motivated with an extraordinary sense of taste and sound, and yes, just the spirit of the moment. And then he asked me actually to do the first recording was the Rhétorique des Dieux, Denis Gautier, and then this led to other ones, and it's actually sort of the line of Astray that I followed all this way, that so 20 or 30 recordings later, it's the same spirit, but the Astray has been resold and sold again, and then this and that and the other thing. So that's one thing. And the other, the first, we had the group with Jordi and Montserrat before the group had a name, actually. So it was just it was four of us with Lorenzo Albert. And even when we made the first double recording of Jewish and Christian music from Renaissance Spain with Sephardic songs and Canciones del Palacio, we didn't have a name. The name came, Jordi found the name a month or two before the recording came out. So these were opportunities. That was EMI. Reflexa Gerd Berg was the spirit behind that series of early music recordings. And there also I had a couple of interesting other recordings to do besides the Hespèrion programs. These things go hand in hand. I never really had a sort of a big time recording contract the way you see the pictures in the magazines of somebody signing their name to no, I never had that. It's always one at a time kind of things with some guarantees to keep going forward.
It's interesting what you said a couple of minutes ago about always having in mind a future recording project when you're preparing things and so forth. It'd be interesting. Would you reflect on the extent to which you guide the recordings? You say he made you an offer. Let's do the Denis Gautier, Rhétorique des Dieux. So a proposal was brought to you and you said, yes, that would be a good thing to do. Are there other times when you also sort of undertake a project that somebody else proposes rather than having something occur to you that I don't know how it works back and forth, probably a bit of each.
There was another Michel Bernstein wish in the early days, which was Albert de Rippe, Alberto Mantovano, Alberto da Ripa, an Italian lutenist, virtuoso, incredibly creative and flashy lutenist who was hired by François Ier in France at the same time that Leonardo da Vinci was at the court. They must have had pizza together. Anyhow, it's because there was a neighbor of Michel Bernstein, Jean-Michel Vaccaro.
Oh, yeah.
In Tours, who had made an edition, who was part of the team of making an edition of Albert de Rip. And Albert de Rip had such literature writing about him and poems dedicated to him and this and that, and his name was here and there all over the place. And Michel had a sort of intuition about this character and what we could make of it. And so that was another one that he proposed. And I don't think, actually, I don't think I had any other special projects proposed by a record company or a record producer that they especially wanted to do. Pretty much after that, it was my own initiative.
Yeah.
There's one other little, well, I say little now, it was a big deal. It took me a year's work, which was the concerto recording, 18th century lute concertos with a Haydn trio, Kohout, Hagen, and Fasch, music for lute and ensemble, string ensemble.
Yeah.
So that was requested by the then director of the Astre series at Ovidis, which was the French company that bought out Astre, the first one that bought out Astre.
Well, it's a great recording career, and I hope it will continue for a long, long time in the future. You're known all over the world, partly from those recordings and partly from the fact that you've taught an awful lot of people over the course of a number of years. And I'm really interested because it has had such an, it seems to me, an influence on American early music. About your reflections on the Schola Cantorum in Basel. We know we've talked to some other people, Kathy Meintz, who was involved in getting the Schola sort of transported to the Baroque Performance Institute at Oberlin, Ben Bagby, who was there for a while and worked with Tom Binkley. But you've been there for quite a long time. My recollection from many years ago was that many of the most serious young American people interested in early music went to the Schola Cantorum in Basel because they thought, probably correctly, that that's where they would get the best teaching and the best musical experience at that time. I don't know whether that was true or not because I never went, but you were there, so, and you've been there for quite a long time. So would you mind, because we're sort of interested in early music in North America, reflecting a little bit on what you think the Schola's influence might have been in North America?
You know, I can't really say too much about the North American side of the influence, just because I've been sitting here most of those years. But let's put it this way, that I think in those back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the impulse came from Europe. And it's not just the Schola, it's partly England and definitely The Hague.
Yes.
And to a certain extent, the impulse still comes from Europe, but there's incredible activity, of course, nowadays in the United States and North and South America and Asia and so forth. And when I first came to the Schola, I don't think there was really one Baroque violinist in Italy, or hardly any.
Right.
And now there are Baroque ensembles everywhere. And it's been like I wouldn't, no. I was going to say something like a virus, but that's too negative. We don't want the virus, no. No, but it has spread just unthinkable extent, the aesthetics, the right kind of instruments, the bows, people who studied with this person, but then went back home and started to teach. And there's people who combine their original place of birth with Europe, and they have a leg in each continent, and keep the information and the inspiration going. And the Schola is one of these centers for early music study with an incredibly extensive theory. And I don't mean just musical theory where you sit there and people tell you things, but where you really are involved with playing the harpsichord or playing this and that, and learning how to read from original notation, and not just playing from the transcriptions. And of course, the further back you go, the more you have to study, because the people who want to study medieval music, they have to know the languages, they have to know the culture, they have to know this and that, and they have to know a number of styles and another number of schools of thought and schools of notation, which you know well. And there's much to be learned, and there's always this conflict between people who just need more time with the instrument and people who want to study and who really appreciate, who know the value of the theoretical things, but they just don't have the time to do it. And interestingly enough, I was looking the other day through this book by Heinrich Neuhaus, the famous Russian piano pedagogue who taught generations of piano virtuosi in Russia. And he said, well, basically, the students should have 6 hours a day with the piano. And I mean, if you have 6 hours a day with the piano, you might be a little exhausted to do your harmony or your counterpoint exercises, but his plan was just to do it and do it and do it, and don't take no for an answer. And so this is something kind of universal. The instrumentalists always want more time, and the theoreticians think, well, you can't go out in the world and play music without knowing these aspects of performance and composition, etc.
But you think the Schola, which has always insisted, among other things, that its students do know some of the historical background, some of the notational styles, some of the theoretical things, that seems to you a good thing?
It's absolutely good. The question is the balance that you have to try and find as a student.
Yes, because you still have to be able to play your instrument, don't you? That's what it's really
improve. Yeah.
Right. You were there, I presume, for some years with Tom Binkley, who then came to America to found the Early Music Institute at Indiana University.
Right.
And he too was a plucky guy. I think of him more as a medieval music guy, that I'm probably selling him short. But the two of you must have overlapped for some time. I know a lot of people who worked with him there, and he seems to have created, like Sequencia, created ensembles, not that he created them, but they're ensembles that sounded sort of like the early music quartet, the studio sort of transposed down a fourth or something like that. There were a lot of people who followed what seems to me the kind of the Binkley model of, or maybe it's the Schola model of taking a repertory and spending a lot of time with it, not just sort of running through a whole lot of stuff, but getting on the inside, sort of being like the people who performed this music. I don't know if my thinking about Binkley's approach is anywhere close to accurate, but what was it like in the time you overlapped with him?
You know, I would say that he inspired a number of ensembles, And what you say about living the music and living the life that led to this music, and that is certainly one of the greatest lessons that a musician can have, to go in depth. And I'll put a little aside in. So often, even students in the Schola say, well, we have this concert tomorrow. Can we play through the program for you? And I said, well, you know, if it's tomorrow, I'm not going to really say anything. and this is to be discouraged, this last minute, oh, we can do it like the professionals, we can put it together. This is not what actually I'm interested in. And it's not what Binkley was interested in either. And what Binkley did in a more general sort of way is inspire your own confidence to make decisions and go forward. I mean, he and I, we had a big departing of ways after a year and a half, but I did study with him and was certainly inspired by that first year. And then the second year, it was a change in me and a little bit of change in him that made me want to go a different way.
Yeah. Well, you both went very interesting ways, and I'm very glad that you did what you did, Hoppy, because you've contributed a lot to the beautiful music that there is out in this world, and to the seriousness with which I think a lot of people now take the enormously extensive lute repertory. It's really astounding how much music there is that one hasn't heard.
Yes, there are still things we're discovering.
Yeah.
Yeah, these sort of lacunae in this century and that century and so forth and so on.
Well, the world has changed a lot. A lot's happened in the time you've been leading the lute world. But if you would, I don't want to spring this on you, but any reflection you have for young people these days about where you think the world is going, or what advice you might have? The world is certainly different now from what it was, and it will continue to be different from what it is now. So, of course, nobody can predict the future, but can I ask you for advice about the future anyway?
One thing that always comes to mind again and again, and especially when a student comes into the class with his or her computer and has the entire repertoire in original sources from every library you could imagine at the push of a button, that really learning an instrument takes as much time now as it did back then. And don't let the seduction of so much information distract you from spending hours and hours looking for sound. And sound is not just, it's not just a commodity. Sound is a sensitivity, and it's something that always has to be renewed. And this is one aspect of it. Another aspect is, there's a little sign I have in the teaching room, the lute teaching room in the Schola, which is an excerpt from the treatise of Bezardus, Jean-Baptiste Bézard, that is translated by Dowland in The Variety of Lute Lessons, London, 1610. And it says, don't, I will paraphrase it, phrase it. He says, don't go from one piece to another, or in all your repertoire, starting at the beginning and going to the end. And don't just play one piece from start to finish, but stay upon any one point. And then he says in parentheses, even though thou playest it over 1,000 times, until you see yourself prettily seen in it. That is what we would say, till you can identify with every movement and every color. And so, or also you could say, when you're really at the molecular level of discovery and interpretation. And these are moments of preparation with an instrument that are inevitable if you want to go forwards.
These are things that never will change, I expect, Hoppy.
I don't think so either. Yes, you can
No.
find new ways of doing things, but really the depth and the depth and the power of sound should be at the base.
Yeah. Well, that's it's great advice from a great musician. I thank you very much indeed for your wisdom and for the pleasure of chatting with you. So thank you very, very much, Hopkinson Smith. Thank you, Hoppy.
Okay, Tom.